Son found his mother on her knees, cleaning the floor in his younger brother's house while crying. What he did left everyone horrified. The afternoon light enveloped the landscape in a warm, peaceful glow. Tall, leafy trees swayed gently in the breeze, and an old bus traveled along a dusty road, leaving a faint cloud of dust behind. Inside that vehicle, Julian, 40 years old, and his 16-year-old daughter Sophia shared the same seat, but held very different feelings. While Sophia kept her nose pressed to the window, fascinated by the contrast of green fields and a few scattered houses, Julian clutched the edge of the seat, tense, his gaze fixed on the distant horizon. The hoarse hum of the engine filled the uncomfortable silence. Hoping to ease the tension, Sophia spoke with a mix of curiosity and youthful cheerfulness. "Dad, did you really live here? It looks different from the stories you told." Julian forced a smile. His features, usually calm, now seemed chiseled by unease. "Yes, I spent my childhood here. But things change, Sophia. Sometimes for the better, other times, not so much." With every kilometer they traveled, Julian's expression hardened. Sophia noticed his fingers drumming on the seat, the way he avoided her gaze whenever she asked why it had taken them so long to return. Under her persistence, her father managed only to say, "It's complicated." Soon after, the bus stopped with a screech that shattered the outer calm. As they got off, father and daughter found themselves in a setting of cobblestone streets, small businesses that seemed half asleep, and a sense that time had chosen to stand still in that corner of the world. Sophia felt no discomfort with the stillness. She inhaled the rural air deeply. But for Julian, every stone along the path seemed to weigh on his soul. Carrying their few belongings, he with a backpack slung over his shoulder, she with a suitcase, their steps echoed in the deserted streets. Sophia felt curiosity, a tingling of expectation. Julian, on the other hand, felt the pull of a past that refused to let go. Even so, the silence and the apparent simplicity of the town whispered a hopeful promise. Perhaps, amid this tense return, they might find truths that could heal old wounds. Maybe the burden Julian felt upon returning home was necessary, a key to opening a door toward reconciliation, forgiveness, and a brighter future. The warm evening breeze barely refreshed the air as Julian and Sophia walked down a street lined with simple houses. At its end stood a modern, imposing building, a concrete giant breaking the rustic harmony of the place. The garden was perfectly trimmed, the flowers arranged in neat rows, and a pair of luxury cars gleamed beneath the fading sunlight. Sophia, eyes wide, admired this display of prosperity. Julian, by contrast, frowned, feeling a bitter knot in his stomach. That opulence, no matter how successful it seemed, didn't fit the humble essence of their family. They approached the main door and knocked softly. They waited a few seconds, but no one answered. Julian clenched his jaw and pushed the slightly ajar gate. Sophia looked at him, uncertain. "Dad, shouldn't we wait?" she asked timidly. "I'd rather not give them time to prepare," he replied in a firm whisper, determined to uncover the truth. "Let's see what's going on inside." They crossed the yard and entered the spacious main hall. Inside, the contrast was just as stark. Luxurious furniture, expensive paintings, a pristine carpet, and the scent of cleanliness. Yet this luxury came at a silent cost. They discovered it when they saw Angel, Julian's mother, kneeling on the floor, scrubbing at a stain with an old towel. The petite woman, wearing worn clothes, was crying soundlessly, as if each tear were a confession of exhaustion and pain. Sophia felt her heart tighten in her chest. Julian, shocked, took a second to find his voice. "Mom, what are you doing here? Why are you doing this?" he exclaimed, his voice breaking with surprise and indignation. Angel jumped, awkwardly rising, hiding her tears with her sleeve. She tried to smile, but the gesture came out weak. "Julian, son, I didn't expect to see you. I just came to clean." "Charles is busy and doesn't have time," she said, in a pleading tone, as if asking forgiveness for being discovered. Just then, Charles appeared at the top of the stairs, wearing a flawless suit that contrasted with his mother's reddened hands. His face showed an uneasy surprise upon seeing Julian. "What are you doing here, brother?" he asked coldly, each word landing heavily in the air. Tension thickened. Julian's gaze, filled with reproach, shifted toward his mother. "Why is our mother cleaning your house as if she were a maid, Charles?" Charles, shrugging indifferently, answered with strange calm. "She insists. She wants to help. I can't tell her no if it makes her happy." Julian felt a burn in his chest, a contained rage struggling to surface. "Happy? You really think this makes her happy?" he demanded, raising his voice. Angel raised her hands, pleading with tearful eyes for Julian not to make a scene. Her gaze, tired after years of silence, reflected deep fear. It was as though her weakened voice silently begged, "Please, don't make things worse." That moment shattered like crystal under pressure. Sophia watched in silence, understanding without words that this family reunion was nothing like the stories her father had once told. Still, amid the harshness, there was a possibility of change. In those uneasy gestures, in Julian's indignation, in Charles's poorly hidden shame, and in Angel's vulnerability, a silent call for truth emerged. Honesty that could cleanse old wounds. This very discomfort, Sophia thought, was the first step for the family to face what they'd kept hidden for so long. It was time to transform pain into opportunity, and although they didn't know it yet, this tense reunion would plant the seed of a change they all needed. The atmosphere in the spacious hall had grown dense, loaded with unspoken words and old resentments. After the initial shock, Julian kept glaring at Charles, while Angel, standing beside Sophia, tried to regain her composure. The soft hum of the vacuum cleaner, still on in a corner, seemed the only sound daring to break the tense silence. "Treating Mom like an employee," Julian said, pointing at the cleaning rag his mother had dropped. "Charles, this is unacceptable. She's our mother, not your servant." Charles, with a crooked smile, stepped forward, maintaining his elegant posture. A flicker of rage and hurt flashed in his eyes before he spoke with calculated sarcasm. "Look who's here to give us moral lessons. The prodigal brother who left Mom behind to chase his dreams in the city. Now you're the grand defender of the family." Julian felt his blood boil. His fists clenched, his breathing quickened. "I left because you manipulated her into selling the house Dad left us," he spat, his voice shaking with anger. "That house was the only thing that tied us to our past, to his memory. And why did you do it? To live a grand life? And now you expect Mom to scrub the floors of your mansion as if nothing happened? Wasn't taking that from her enough?" Julian's words fell like heavy stones onto the immaculate floor. Charles stared back, struggling to remain calm, but a slight tick in his jaw betrayed his growing anger. Angel, eyes still red, raised her hands to her chest in a gesture of supplication. Her lips trembled before she spoke in a broken voice. "Please, don't fight. We're a family. I don't want to lose you both too." Her plea cut through the air like a knife. The tension was tangible. Sophia, not daring to speak, placed a hand on her grandmother's shoulder to offer silent comfort. The young girl felt the weight of years of resentment, secrets, and guilt emerging in a matter of seconds, like witnessing two trains laden with unresolved emotions collide head-on. Silence settled once more, interrupted only by Angel's quiet sobbing. Outside, the sky began to take on the last hues of dusk. Sophia realized that what she was witnessing was a breaking point. The whole family stood on a tightrope, and the choice to confront or evade their issues would define their future. In that moment, as Julian and Charles measured each other with hard stares, and Angel struggled to keep them united, the tension in the room became a force that could tear them apart forever, or push them to find the courage to heal old wounds. The day dragged on slowly. Outside, the sun dipped below the horizon, casting a warm golden light through the kitchen window. While voices rose in the other part of the house, Julian and Charles still locked in bitter confrontation, the atmosphere here was different. Inside the kitchen, the gentle aroma of herbal tea floated in the air, mingling with the soft steam from the boiling water. A tray on the countertop held simple yet well-cared-for porcelain cups. Sophia entered quietly, watching her grandmother absorbed in a seemingly simple task that nonetheless seemed to consume all her energy. Angel, eyes fixed on the kettle, didn't notice her granddaughter's presence until Sophia spoke softly. "Grandma, can I help you with something?" Angel turned in surprise, blinking as if emerging from a trance. Her face showed fatigue, but also an attempt at serenity. Sophia stepped closer, hoping to build a bridge between generations that could open the door to the truth. "It's not necessary, dear," Angel said, trying to smile. "I can manage on my own. But thank you." Sophia moved nearer, using a pot holder to handle the freshly boiled kettle. Her young eyes, full of curiosity and empathy, met her grandmother's. "Grandma," she said softly, "why don't you tell Dad and Charles what you feel? It seems like you're more worried about them getting along than about what you really need. Don't you think your voice is important?" Angel sighed. Her shoulders sank a bit, as if decades of burden weighed them down. "It's complicated, Sophia. Charles has done a lot for this family. He's always made sure we never lacked anything, that we could have a better life. I don't want him to think I'm a burden, or that I blame him for what he's done." Sophia tilted her head, perplexed by that logic. She tried to unravel the code of loyalties and guilt pulsing in her grandmother's heart. "What do you mean by, he did a lot? What are you referring to, Grandma? What was it like growing up with Dad and Charles? Why is it so hard for you to tell him how you feel?" Sophia's voice was gentle, free of judgment, loaded only with curiosity and affection. Yet, upon hearing these questions, Angel averted her gaze. Her hands trembled slightly as she arranged the cups, suddenly very interested in the spoon's exact position on the saucer. "No, this isn't the right time, Sophia. Let's take this tea to the living room," she said, changing the subject delicately. "The water's going to get cold." Even so, Sophia didn't miss the tremor in her grandmother's voice or the dampness in her eyes. There was a sorrow there, hidden beneath layers of loyalty and self-denial, an old, deep-rooted sadness. Sophia understood that, just like the tea steeping in silence, the truth needed its time. Perhaps this wasn't the moment to force the words, but rather the time to offer a gentle bond, a gesture of understanding. As both left the kitchen carrying the tray, Sophia knew she had taken a small step. Maybe, with patience and kindness, she could help her grandmother find the courage to raise her voice, share her feelings, and set down the heavy load she carried. Amid the chaos and arguments, a discreet and honest connection was forming between them, the first step toward a deeper, healing understanding. Night had fallen over the town with a mantle of stillness. The cobblestone streets, which by day seemed asleep, now breathed a serene silence. Julian walked between old facades, his footsteps softly echoing in the dim light. He had left the house without warning, driven by the need to clear his mind after the day's disputes. The central plaza emerged before him as a haven lit by faint lanterns. Under the amber glow, the branches of an old tree etched filigrees on the ground. There, seated on one of the wooden benches, Julian recognized Marco, his childhood friend. Marco, who now worked as the town's lawyer, looked up upon sensing Julian's presence and offered a tired smile. "Julian, it's been a while," Marco said cordially. "It has," Julian replied, sitting beside him with a sigh. For a few moments, they remained silent, as if the distant chirp of crickets was enough. But both knew why those unspoken words weighed on them: the return, the family tension, the lingering doubts of the past. "Everyone here knew what was happening, Julian," Marco began, running his fingers over an old keychain. Charles convinced your mother to sell the family land, promising to invest in a business. He said it would be good for all of you. And Angel believed him. She always defended him, even when we, from the outside, saw things differently. Julian clenched his jaw. He remembered those days with painful clarity. He had tried to stop the sale, warning that it was the last tangible legacy of his father. But Angel, blinded by the need to believe in the son who promised prosperity, accused him of selfishness, of not understanding the family's needs. That argument had been a lingering wound that scarred him as he left. People thought Charles's move was dirty, Marco went on, but no one said it out loud. Your mother always made excuses for him. Charles does what's best for us, she would say, even though we all knew it wasn't that simple. Guilt mixed with fury in Julian's chest, a bitter cocktail difficult to swallow. He had fled that past because it hurt too much. Now, upon returning, he found a wall of lies, silences, and manipulations explaining the open wounds between him and Charles. He appreciated Marco's honest gesture, knowing that a friend's words shone a necessary light on the darkness surrounding him. When they said goodbye, Julian felt heavy, but also more aware. He headed back toward Charles's house, noticing how shadows danced on the walls. Upon arrival, before entering, he saw Sophia and Angel in the yard. Sophia was seated beside her grandmother on a bench, while Angel spoke in a low voice. He couldn't make out the words, but he could see the way Sophia inclined her head, attentive, with a tender understanding that Julian himself had lacked in his youth. For the first time in many years, Julian realized that his daughter was delving into the family's secrets with more bravery than he ever had. That the next generation, embodied in Sophia, held the power to break the cycle of silences, guilt, and sacrifice that had consumed the family. And maybe, just maybe, that new light Sophia radiated could be the key to piecing together the broken fragments of the past. Late afternoon light slipped through the blinds of Charles's office, painting the mess in ochre tones. Piles of papers, overdue invoices, and unfinished financial files covered the desk and part of the floor. The air smelled of old paper and cold coffee. Charles, seated in his leather chair, kept his eyes fixed on a report with red figures that seemed to shout his failure. The cell phone screen on the table blinked insistently, showing missed calls from the Duarte brothers, whose last name now knotted his stomach. Hours earlier, he had faced Emilio and Tony Duarte in person. Emilio, the elder, had spoken with icy calm. "Charles, we know your businesses aren't going well, but we aren't patient by choice. We want our money." Tony, the younger, had added, his words accompanied by a smile that promised nothing good. "We like solving things without problems, but when quick solutions don't appear, we get creative." Charles had nodded, promising payment, though the words came out forced, almost choking in his throat. He knew he was trapped in a web of debts and interest, with no clear way out. The impeccable suit and aura of success couldn't hide the inner tremor rattling him. Outside, the world kept turning, but inside his office, time seemed frozen in that anguishing uncertainty. Later that evening at home, Charles struggled to maintain his facade. The residence still sparkled with opulence, but now it felt more like a reminder of his lies than a source of pride. In the living room, the dim lighting and the distant murmur of the television tried to create a normal atmosphere, while he drank one whiskey after another, combing through the papers that held no answers. Sarah, his wife, noticed his nervousness. She approached quietly, sitting beside him on the sofa. "Charles, you haven't been yourself lately. What's going on?" she asked, a mixture of concern and affection in her voice as she tilted her head to catch his eye. Charles, irritated and defensive, looked away. "Nothing I can't handle. Stop worrying about things you don't understand." Those words, cold and cutting, fell upon Sarah like a sentence. She narrowed her eyes, sensing the darkness behind her husband's silence. She felt hurt, yet also alert. Her instinct screamed that Charles was hiding far more than simple business setbacks. As he stood up with his glass in hand, ending the conversation with hurried steps, Sarah knew that the man she had admired for his apparent security now showed ever-deepening cracks. Something inside her warned that the structure of their life was on the verge of collapsing, and that all of them would feel the impact. The late afternoon sun filtered through the window of Angel's room, bathing the sheets in a warm, dusty glow. Sophia, crouched under the bed, tried to reach an old wooden box she'd found while helping her grandmother tidy up. It was rectangular, the wood darkened with age, the corners slightly splintered, and it wore a thin coat of dust. Pulling it out, Sophia felt as though she'd discovered a small treasure chest from the past, something that might offer more clues about her family's story. "Grandma, can I see what's inside?" Sophia asked softly, holding the box in both hands. Angel froze for a second. Her eyes fell on the box, and a spark of longing crossed her gaze. She hesitated, but finally nodded with a slight bow of her head, almost resigned. "Go ahead, dear. It's time someone else learns those stories," she said, sitting on the bed and nervously smoothing the edge of her skirt. Sophia lifted the lid slowly, releasing a scent of old paper and dormant memories. Inside were black and white photographs, letters with faded ink, and yellowed newspaper clippings. She took one particular photograph and held it up to the light. A young angel standing beside her husband, smiling with hope-filled eyes. At their feet, Julian and Charles, just children, looked at the camera innocently. The joy radiating from the image contrasted sharply with the tired, bittersweet expression of the woman Sophia saw now. "You looked so happy, Grandma," Sophia said in a near whisper, afraid of breaking the spell. "That was another time, Sophia," Angel murmured. "When your grandfather was alive, I felt we had a promising future. But things change, and not always in our favor." And Sophia pulled out one of the letters at the bottom of the box, the paper crackling as she unfolded it. Angel's slanted handwriting filled the lines with fears, with the uncertainty following her husband's death, and with the daily struggle to feed and raise her children alone. Sophia could picture her grandmother, younger, sitting by lamplight, pouring her anguish and hope onto the page, with no one to hear her sleepless worries. With a voice cracked by melancholy, Angel whispered, "After your grandfather died, everything changed. I was left alone with your uncles, not knowing what to do. Charles was always the most ambitious. He promised we'd pull through, but sometimes he made decisions I couldn't understand. And Julian, he was different, more sensitive. I think he carried the weight of the world on his shoulders, but he never truly stayed. He ran away, I suppose, from responsibility, from pain, from the scars of this land." Sophia, heart tight, asked gently, "And how was it between them? How did Charles and Julian get along?" Angel sighed, each breath seeming to drag years of voiceless memories. "Julian was always the one who felt things deeply, who cried and argued, but also laughed with more abandon. Charles, on the other hand, was the one who thought and planned, sometimes without considering the emotional cost. And I tried to keep the balance, never losing either of them. I didn't want them to see me as weak, or to feel I was a burden." Sophia observed her grandmother with a new tenderness, realizing that there was more history in her silence than in any reproach. She now understood that Angel carried a mixture of love and guilt toward her children, never daring to blame anyone directly, accepting pain as a natural consequence of life. As they placed the memories back into the box, Sophia felt something inside her settle into place. Her family wasn't perfect, but understanding the roots of the pain, guilt, and sacrifice brought her closer to the truth. She now knew a bit more about the buried past that still echoed in the present, and she promised herself not to let those silences continue eating away at the hearts of the people she loved most. Dinner took place in an oppressive atmosphere. The table, impeccably set, served as an ironic backdrop to the emotional chaos that grew with every passing second. Charles, seated at the head of the table, drummed his fingers on the polished wood, struggling to maintain a calm demeanor. To his left, Sarah kept her gaze down, as if afraid to interfere. Angel, at the opposite end, tried to smile, but tension bowed her shoulders. Julian and Sophia had arrived reluctantly, aware that this evening would not bring peace. It was Charles who shattered the silence with a sharp voice. "Ever since you came back, Mum seems more uneasy. You always were good at stirring things up, Julian." Julian, who until then had been listlessly picking at a piece of meat on his plate, lifted his gaze calmly, refusing to yield. "All I'm doing is seeing things for what they are. What bothers me more? That Mom keeps cleaning your house, or that you believe it's acceptable?" The clash of those words seemed to spark something in the air. Angel swallowed hard, nervous, and tried to mediate by raising a hand. "Please, boys, don't fight. Charles has done a lot for this family. Everything he has, he earned through hard work." Charles seized on her words as a springboard. Turning to Angel, he adopted a tone of wounded understanding. "That's what Julian never understood, Mom. While he went off on his own, I had to shoulder everything. Can you imagine what it's like to keep up the house, the expenses, making sure we never lacked anything?" Julian's heart pounded with contained fury. He felt the poison in his brother's words, painting him as irresponsible and ungrateful. He refused to allow it. "Shoulder everything? Is that what you call manipulating her into selling the only thing we had left? For what, Charles? To live in a palace empty of affection while our mother kneels down to scrub your floors?" Silence fell over the table. Time seemed to freeze, breaths turning slow and heavy. Julian's words, harsh and precise, struck like a well-aimed arrow at the facade Charles had built. Charles opened his mouth, but found no immediate reply. Meanwhile, Angel crumbled. Tears began to roll down her cheeks, and her trembling voice rose in earnest plea. "Stop, please. We're a family. I don't want to lose you both too." Sophia, a silent witness, felt a lump in her throat. She watched, heart aching, as masks fell away, revealing the deep cracks eating at her family. In the center of this whirlwind of reproach and pain, her grandmother wept, her father seethed, and her uncle barricaded himself behind his pride. The young girl understood, with painful clarity, that the wounds of the past had reached the present with relentless force. As Angel's tears fell onto the spotless tablecloth, Sophia knew that whatever decisions were made next could spell the difference between a final rupture and the first step toward healing. Afternoon light filtered through the leaves in the garden, casting small dancing patches on the lawn. A gentle breeze carried the scent of flowers and the distant murmur of children playing in the street. Amid this apparent peace, Sarah and Sophia sat side by side on a wooden bench, sharing the silence that follows great revelations. Sarah, arms crossed, watched the garden with a furrowed brow. She had witnessed the previous night's dinner outburst, Charles and Julian's confrontation, Angel's tears, and the tension that stained the air. Although her role had always been to stand by Charles without asking uncomfortable questions, Sophia's presence, her niece by marriage, began to shift that dynamic. "Aunt Sarah," Sophia said, her tone calm and mature, unusual for a girl her age, "why does Charles treat my grandmother like that? It seems she can never say what she really feels." The direct, sincere question hit Sarah like a hard truth. At first she tensed, uncertain, but Sophia's clear-eyed gaze encouraged her to be honest, at least a bit. "Charles is under a lot of pressure, Sophia," she finally answered, choosing her words carefully. "I know he doesn't always make the best decisions, but I think in his mind, he believes he's doing what's right. He wants to maintain control and ensure everyone's well-being, even if that means ignoring some important things." Sophia tilted her head, not satisfied. "What's right for whom? Because it doesn't seem like he cares how my grandmother feels. It's not fair that she can't speak, that she has to feel grateful for favors that actually humiliate her. Sophia's words pierced Sarah's conscience. She had never stopped to look at the situation from such an honest angle. Until now, she preferred to believe that Charles did the best he could, that his actions were justified by the responsibilities he carried. But Sophia's gaze, so like Julian's in moments of clarity, planted a seed of doubt in her heart. Later that same day, Sarah passed by Charles's study and heard him talking on the phone. His tone was harsh and urgent, and the words Duarte and deadline were repeated insistently. Sarah lingered behind the door, holding her breath. Charles was lying, not only to her, but to everyone. He was pretending before his mother, Julian, Sophia, and even his own wife. When he hung up, Charles turned and saw her. He tensed, but before he could say anything, Sarah pretended she hadn't heard and walked away, her chest tight with worry. Sophia's questions echoed in her mind. Was he really doing it for the family's well-being, or was it an obsessive need for control and appearances? Sarah realized that her husband was hiding not only a financial crisis, but also undermining Angel's voice and dignity. That night, as she revisited old wedding photos and memories of simpler times, Sarah found herself wondering how long she had been a silent accomplice to an unfair dynamic. She realized that Sophia's perceptive and empathetic mind had accomplished something no one else had. It had planted doubt. A doubt that, as it grew, might help her see the truth more clearly, and perhaps act accordingly. The small garden behind the house lay still, surrounded by shrubs whispering in the wind and trees stretching their branches as if trying to embrace the sky. It was a simple nook, with green-leafed plants and modest flowers that seemed to hold a silent dialogue with the earth. Sophia walked alongside Angel, who wore a simple apron and held gardening shears in her hand. Their steps were slow, the silence comfortable. But Sophia felt that something needed to be said, something that had been building inside her for days. "Grandma," she began softly but firmly, "did you ever feel that you had to sacrifice too much for your children?" Angel stopped dead in her tracks. The question seemed to catch her off guard. She turned to her granddaughter, eyes narrowing as if trying to decipher the meaning behind the words. She remained silent for a moment, her gaze drifting among the leaves. Finally, she answered in a low, thoughtful voice, "Sophia, being a mother means making sacrifices. But sometimes I wonder if I did it right." Angel's honesty moved Sophia, but also encouraged her to go on. "Grandma, sometimes I think sacrifice doesn't have to mean giving everything. Did you ever take time for yourself? To think about what you wanted, what you needed?" Angel pressed her lips together, as if trying to contain a wave of emotions long repressed. Her hands trembled slightly as she snipped a dry leaf from a nearby plant. "There were moments when I wanted to, Sophia," she admitted, sighing deeply. "When your grandfather died, I wanted to keep some money aside for myself, or make decisions that would make me feel secure. But Charles always found the words to convince me that we should use it for the family's good. 'Mom, it's for us,' he'd say. And I gave in." Her eyes filled with tears, but they did not fall. The rigidity of years spent bottling up her feelings still stood, like a barrier protecting her heart, yet also imprisoning it. Sophia stepped closer, gently placing a hand on Angel's arm. "Grandma," she said with a tenderness capable of healing any wound, "I believe you have the right to say what you feel. Just because you're their mother doesn't mean you have to carry everything. You have a life, emotions, and you deserve to have them heard." Those words were like a key that opened a door locked for decades. Angel, who had always contained her tears, began to cry. But this time, the tears were not of sadness or despair, but a mixture of release and acknowledgement. Her repressed emotions flowed like an overflowing river, carrying away years of pain and guilt. Sophia held her, embracing her firmly, while the wind's murmur seemed to join in the catharsis. Angel finally spoke, her voice broken yet steady. I never allowed myself to think of myself, Sophia. I always thought that was selfish. But maybe you're right. I can't go on like this." Sophia did not reply, but her embrace was enough. She knew this moment marked a change, a rebirth for her grandmother. The garden, witness to that intimate instant, seemed more alive than ever, as if the emotions released had also nourished the earth. In that corner of the world, Angel began to reclaim something she had lost long ago: her voice, her dignity, and above all, the freedom to be herself. The afternoon heat seemed to amplify the tension Julian felt in his chest. Since his return, every interaction with Charles had been a battle filled with reproach and uncomfortable silences. But something deeper was starting to surface, a dark suspicion he couldn't ignore. There were details in his brother's behavior that didn't fit: his constant nervousness, his evasive answers whenever money came up, and above all, their mother's role in this dynamic. Julian couldn't just stand by. That morning, while he sorted through an old toolbox in the garage, Sophia approached, her expression full of worry and curiosity. "Dad," she said, with that maturity of hers that always surprised him, "if you feel something's wrong, why don't you look for proof? Maybe you can help Grandma. She can't do it alone." Sophia's words were like a trigger. Julian knew she was right. He could no longer rely solely on his intuition. He needed answers, and he knew exactly where to start. Later that day, Julian went to the town's property registry office, a small building with faded walls and an air of old bureaucracy. Upon entering, he was greeted by Mario, an old family acquaintance who now worked there, overseeing the archives. After a brief greeting, Julian got straight to the point. "Mario, I need you to help me find information about my mother's house. Something doesn't add up in the documents. I want to know who's listed as the current owner." Mario looked at him curiously, but nodded. "Give me a moment, Julian. Let's see what we can find." A few minutes later, Mario returned with a file in hand. His face showed a mix of discomfort and regret. "Julian, the house is registered under Charles's name, and it appears he used it as collateral for a considerable loan a few years back." Julian felt the ground shift beneath his feet. He took the papers, reviewing them meticulously. There it was, clear as day. The house that should have been part of the family inheritance was completely under Charles's control. Worse still, he had mortgaged it to secure a $1 million loan. Each piece of the puzzle began to fit in his mind. Charles was in financial trouble, and Angel was a key part of his survival strategy. With the documents in hand and a mix of fury and determination in his heart, Julian said goodbye to Mario and left the office. He knew that what he had discovered was only the tip of the iceberg. Back at Charles's house, Julian found his brother in his study, on the phone. From the hallway, he could hear him, though the words were fragmented. "I need more time. I can't lose this property. Yes, I'm working on it." Charles paced back and forth, sweating, his face pale. His voice dripped with urgency, almost desperation. Although Julian couldn't hear the entire conversation, he knew enough. His mother wasn't just a victim of circumstance. Charles had turned her into his emotional and financial guarantor, manipulating her to save himself from his own failure. Julian stepped away from the study, his face grim. Clutching the documents to his chest, one thought tormented him. It wasn't just the house at stake, but also his mother's emotional stability. This truth could not remain hidden. Charles would have to answer for his actions, and this time, Julian was determined to protect Angel at all costs. A warm breeze drifted through the house's patio, carrying the scent of damp earth and the distant sound of crickets. Angel, much younger then, sat at the kitchen table, her trembling hands folding her children's clothes with care. The death of her husband had left an impossible void, but she had chosen to face it bravely. Each day was a silent battle, fought for the well-being of Charles and Julian. At the doorway appeared Charles, then a teenager, with unusual determination in his eyes. "Mom, don't worry," he said, stepping closer with firm strides. "If we sell the land, we can build something better. It will be for everyone's good." Angel looked at him, a mix of hope and doubt in her gaze. Charles's words, full of promises, were like a balm for her anxiety. Still, behind her exhaustion, a quiet voice warned her something wasn't quite right. But Charles was persuasive, and Angel, drained by years of struggle, gave in. Days later, with the papers before her, Angel held the pen in trembling hands. Tears gathered in her eyes, but Charles, seated by her side, encouraged her with optimistic words. From across the room, Julian, now a young adult, watched the scene with frustration. "Mom, this isn't right," Julian exclaimed, approaching quickly. "That land was the only thing Dad wanted us to keep. It's our legacy." Angel looked at him, trying to explain gently. "Charles says it will be better for everyone. We need that money, Julian. We can't hold on to the past." With a shaky stroke, she signed the documents. In the blink of an eye, heavy machinery arrived to destroy the plot of land that had once been the family's pride. Angel watched from a distance, tears in her eyes, as the memories of her husband and their history crumbled beneath the excavator's blades. Charles stood beside her, promising a better future, but the feeling of loss clung to her for years. In the present, Julian sat in the patio, his face shadowed by a mix of anger and guilt. His fingers drummed against the chair's edge as he reflected on his decision to leave back then. He'd felt powerless to stop the inevitable, but now he understood that his absence had left his mother vulnerable to Charles's decisions. Sophia came out of the house and approached cautiously. Concern clouded her gaze. "Dad, what did you find out?" she asked, sitting beside him. Julian sighed deeply before answering. "That I left when they needed me most, and now Charles is destroying what little we have left." Sophia looked at him with empathy, understanding that his words were not only a reflection on the past, but also an acknowledgement of his responsibility in the present. Both knew the fight wasn't over, and that this time they couldn't afford to fail. The roar of a luxurious black SUV shattered the quiet monotony of the street in front of Charles's house. The vehicle braked abruptly near the entrance, and the doors slammed open. Emilio and Tony Duarte, impeccably dressed in dark suits that seemed to absorb the sunlight, stepped out with precise movements. Their footsteps mixed authority and menace as they advanced toward the property. Charles appeared at the main door, nervous, yet trying to appear calm. He walked toward them with raised hands in a conciliatory gesture, though his face reflected the tension of a man who knows he's lost control. "Gentleman Duarte, this isn't necessary. I'm working on it," Charles said, nearly pleading, stopping at the gate to prevent them from going any further. Emilio ignored him, stepping closer. His gaze was hard and cold as he spoke in a deliberately low voice, heavy with meaning. "Charles, there's no more time. We need the money, or the house is ours. We don't care if you have to kick your mother out." Charles opened his mouth but didn't know how to respond. His eyes darted toward the living room window, where he thought he saw a shadow move. Behind the glass, Angel watched the scene, pale-faced, her trembling hands pressed against the frame. Every word Emilio spoke hammered in her ears like a blow. The house, her refuge, was in danger, and the cause was obvious: Charles's decisions. "Just give me a couple more weeks," Charles yelled, trying to maintain composure as he lifted his hands defensively. "I'm closing a deal. I'll have the money." Tony, the younger Duarte, gave a mocking smile as he leaned closer to Charles's ear, speaking softly enough that only he could hear. "You have 2 weeks. After that, this house is ours, whether you like it or not." Charles remained motionless, face flushed, fists clenched, as the Duarte brothers turned with infuriating calm and climbed back into their vehicle. The SUV roared again before disappearing down the street, leaving a silence thick with tension behind. Inside the house, Angel staggered back, clutching her chest as she tried to absorb what she'd just heard. Her blind faith in Charles, which she'd maintained for years, began to crack. The Duarte brothers' words left no room for doubt. Charles had endangered the last symbol of stability they had left. Charles entered the house, his face contorted, a cold sweat beading his forehead. In the hallway, he crossed paths with Angel, who looked at him with eyes full of both fear and disappointment. They exchanged no words, but the silence between them spoke louder than any reproach. Charles looked away and continued toward his office, leaving his mother standing there, feeling once more that all her son's misguided choices weighed heavily on her shoulders. Sarah had known something was off for weeks. Charles's erratic behavior, his constant evasions, and the tension that seemed to saturate every corner of the house had made her uneasy. That afternoon, while organizing papers in her office, she decided to look for answers herself. She sifted through documents without much thought, until, moving one folder aside, she found an envelope Charles had hidden carefully behind a file drawer. Her heart pounded as she opened it. Inside, she found the terms of the loan with the Duarte brothers, a document chillingly clear about the magnitude of the debt Charles had taken on. But what truly paralyzed her was the deed to the house, in Charles's name, with Angel's signature as guarantor. Sarah stood still, her eyes filling with tears as she grasped the full extent of what her husband had done. He had put his mother's only refuge at risk, and worse still, had done so without telling her. That night, Sarah couldn't hold back. She waited until Charles was alone in the living room and entered with the papers in hand. Her voice trembled, but it was laden with indignation. "Charles, why did you do this to your mother?" she asked, holding the documents out as irrefutable evidence. "How could you use the house as collateral without telling her the truth?" Charles looked up, first surprised, then furious. He stood abruptly, trying to regain control of the situation. "You have no idea what it means to carry this family," he snapped, raising his voice. "Everything I do is to keep us afloat. Do you think this is easy for me?" But Sarah refused to be intimidated. She had heard similar excuses before, but this time the price was too high. Her voice broke, but her words were firm. "You're not keeping anyone afloat, Charles. You're destroying the people who love you most. Your mother trusts you, and you're using her to keep up your facade of success. What have you become?" Charles, wounded by the undeniable truth, lashed out in anger. "Whose side are you on, Sarah?" he said, his tone acidic. "If you can't support me, then you don't need to be here." Sarah felt the blow of those words like a slap. Her face showed as much pain as resolve. Without another word, she turned on her heel and headed to the bedroom. She closed the door behind her, leaving Charles alone in the living room, surrounded by his anger and despair. For the first time, he began to realize he was losing not only the house, but also the people who truly mattered in his life. The sound of a chair scraping against the wooden floor marked the start of the meeting in Marco's small office. Julian sat across from the worn desk, while Marco, his sleeves rolled up and his glasses slipping down the bridge of his nose, listened intently. The walls were decorated with certificates and framed photos, but the atmosphere in the room was heavy with seriousness. Julian began to speak with a steady tone, explaining every detail of what he had discovered. He spoke of the loan documents, of the deed in Charles's name, and of how Angel, his mother, had signed as guarantor without fully understanding the implications. Marco did not interrupt, but his expression grew more somber as Julian finished laying out his case. "Charles was always clever, but this is a different level," said Marco at last, folding his hands on the desk. "If the house is in his name, he technically has the right to use it as collateral. It's morally questionable, but legally difficult to challenge." Julian pressed his lips together, struggling to remain calm. His steady gaze on Marco reflected the internal battle he fought between frustration and the need to find a solution. "There has to be a way to undo this. I can't let Mom lose the house because of him." Marco let out a long sigh, picking up a pen to scribble something on a piece of paper in front of him. "Julian, the process would be complicated, especially if your mother isn't willing to face it. She signed the documents, and although we could argue manipulation or coercion, we'd need her to admit it and testify. From what I know about Angel, she's always protected Charles, even when he doesn't deserve it. Marco's words hit Julian like a bucket of cold water, but they also ignited a spark of determination. He knew Marco was right. The main obstacle wasn't the law, but his mother's willingness to accept the truth and take action. That would be the greatest challenge. Leaving the office, Julian took a deep breath, letting the town's fresh air clear his head. As he walked along the cobblestone streets, images of his mother, worn down and trapped under the weight of past sacrifices, filled his mind. He clenched his fists and moved forward decisively. He knew he had to talk to Angel, make her see what Charles had done, and more importantly, convince her that it was time to face that truth. The sun began to set on the horizon as he reached the house. Concern and resolve lined his face. He knew the conversation he was about to have wouldn't be easy, but he also knew he had no choice. What was at stake wasn't just a house, but his mother's dignity and peace of mind. Julian was willing to fight for both. The aroma of carefully prepared dishes filled Charles's home as the last rays of sunlight slipped through the perfectly clean windows. The dinner was meant to impress, a table adorned with candelabras, fine china, and gleaming glasses beneath the central lamp. Charles moved about with apparent calm, adjusting small details, while Sarah, visibly tense, played the role of the perfect hostess. Angel, as usual, was in the kitchen, making sure everything was ready, her hands busy and her gaze distant. Julian and Sophia arrived just before the food was served. Their faces showed reluctance, aware that this evening would be anything but relaxing. Sophia watched Angel, wearing a worn apron, pass by with a tray of appetizers, while Charles greeted his guests with a smile that never reached his eyes. During dinner, Charles dominated the conversation, enthusiastically recounting his supposed achievements and future projects. His words flowed easily, and the guests, mostly colleagues and business associates, nodded approvingly. But at the far end of the table, Julian observed every detail, every gesture, every carefully chosen word. When Angel passed behind Charles to refill the wine glasses, he made a remark that seemed casual, but was loaded with condescension. "Mom has always been good at organizing small things. I think that's why she insists on helping here. She likes feeling useful." Angel smiled nervously, saying nothing to defend herself, continuing as if she hadn't heard. But Julian couldn't hold back any longer. He put his silverware down and spoke in a clear voice. "I'm not sure I'd call it helping to treat her like your employee." His comment brought the table to an uncomfortable silence. The murmurs stopped, and all eyes turned to Julian and Charles. The latter, visibly annoyed, responded sarcastically, "Julian, don't make a drama out of this. Mom does what she wants. Are you going to tell me how to run my house now?" Angel, who'd remained still at the table's edge, tried to intervene with a trembling voice that betrayed more fear than conviction. "Please, don't fight. It's just a dinner. Everything's fine." But it wasn't fine, and Sophia knew it. From her seat, she watched how Angel avoided everyone's eyes, her shoulders hunched as if she wanted to disappear. The emotional manipulation Charles exerted over her was obvious to Sophia, who saw clearly what her grandmother wouldn't dare admit. As dinner continued in an atmosphere charged with tension, the facade Charles tried to maintain began to crack. Julian's words, Sophia's looks, and Angel's trembling silence were signs that hidden truths were edging closer to the surface. The dinner, intended as a showcase of success, was turning into a reminder of the irreparable fissures in the family. That night, while the raised voices of Julian and Charles filtered in from the living room, Sophia took refuge in the kitchen, where Angel was preparing a cup of tea. The yellowish light illuminated her grandmother's tired face as she stirred the liquid with mechanical movements, as if trying to lose herself in the rising steam. Sophia sat next to her, watching closely. "Grandma," said Sophia, her tone calm but direct, Why don't you ever tell Charles how you feel? It seems like he doesn't listen to you." Angel sighed deeply, still stirring the tea, her eyes avoiding her granddaughter's, as if she feared confronting a truth she'd avoided for years. "Charles has a lot of pressures," she finally replied in a resigned tone. "He's always felt he had to carry everything. I just want to help him." Sophia tilted her head, analyzing each word. She wondered if her grandmother truly believed that, or if it was something she'd repeated so many times she could no longer distinguish it from reality. "But it doesn't seem like he respects you," Sophia insisted, recalling the dinner's comments. "Whenever he talks about you, it's as if you weren't important, as if everything you do is a favor to him, not something you deserve." Sophia's words fell like a stone into a still pond, breaking the superficial calm Angel had maintained. The older woman stopped and set the spoon on the saucer, her hand trembling slightly. She looked at Sophia in silence, her lips parted as if she wanted to answer, but didn't know how. For the first time, the doubts she had long buried began to surface. Was she really helping Charles, or had she simply let him manipulate her for years? Later, Sophia stepped into the garden, seeking a bit of fresh air. The rustle of leaves and the moon's soft light kept her company as she tried to process her conversation with her grandmother. Just then, Sarah appeared, walking slowly with a thoughtful expression. Noticing Sophia's presence, she offered a weak smile and came closer. "Can't sleep?" asked Sarah, sitting on a nearby bench. Sophia shook her head and, after a moment of silence, decided to speak. "Aunt Sarah, why don't you say anything about how Charles treats Grandma? I don't think it's fair. She deserves better." Sarah, surprised by Sophia's frankness, fell silent for a moment. Finally, she let out a sigh laden with years of holding back. "I've been married to Charles for years, and I've always believed he was doing what's best for this family. But lately, I'm not so sure." Sophia watched her with curiosity. Her words echoed the doubts that Sophia herself had begun to form. "Why don't you say anything? Don't you think it would help Grandma?" Sarah lowered her gaze as if the answers were written in the ground at her feet. "Charles doesn't listen to anyone. It's as if he's trapped in his own lies. He always thinks he's right, and if you contradict him, well, things don't end well." Sophia listened intently, connecting the pieces. Her grandmother's words, Charles's comments, Sarah's resignation, all pointed to a clear pattern. Charles had been manipulating Angel for years, using her guilt and loyalty to maintain control. The young girl realized that change wouldn't come from within. Someone had to act to break the cycle. She was determined to do so, even though she didn't know exactly how. As she looked at the stars, a silent determination formed in her heart. She would not let her grandmother remain a prisoner of the past. Angel woke that morning with a different feeling in her chest, as though something inside her had begun to shift. To free itself from a weight she'd carried for so long, she'd forgotten what it felt like to be light. The sunlight filtered through the half-opened curtains, filling her room with a warm glow. She remained in bed for a few minutes, staring at the ceiling, letting her mind wander through the memories that Sophia's words had stirred up. When she finally got up, it wasn't with her usual rush. Instead of hurrying to the kitchen or to the chores that awaited her, Angel opened an old trunk that had been gathering dust in a corner. Inside, she found a worn photo album with slightly faded covers. She sat on the edge of the bed and began to flip through the pages, her fingers tracing over the images of a past that, despite its hardships, had also held moments of hope. In one of the photos, she stood beside her husband, young and smiling, his arms around a young Charles and an even younger Julian. She remembered how in those days, though life was not easy, the family's unity made everything bearable. But after her husband's death, things had changed. Charles had taken on the role of protector, and in that process, she had begun to yield parts of herself, bit by bit. One particular memory emerged vividly, the day Charles convinced her to sell the family land. She could see it with unsettling clarity, as if it were happening again. Charles, still young but already exuding that confident, persuasive air, had said, "If we don't do this, we'll never move forward. Do you want us to live like this forever?" His words had been a mix of promise and reproach, and she, exhausted by the responsibility of keeping the family together, had given in. Now, looking back at that decision with the distance of years, Angel could see what she had lost, not only materially, but also emotionally. She had allowed her voice to be silenced, her own needs relegated in the name of supposed family well-being. She closed the album and set it aside, taking a deep breath. Sophia's words echoed in her mind. "You have the right to say how you feel. Being their mother doesn't mean you have to carry it all." For the first time in a long while, Angel felt that perhaps she was right. The time had come to regain some of what she had lost. That morning, Angel made a decision. She would not clean the house. She wouldn't iron the clothes. She wouldn't tend to any of the tasks she always took on without being asked. Instead, she stayed in her room, reading a book that had been gathering dust on her bedside table for months. It was a small act of resistance, but to her, it meant the world. Charles noticed her absence almost immediately. As he walked through the house, looking for his usual perfectly prepared cup of coffee or the freshly changed sheets, frustration began to grow inside him. Finally, he headed to Angel's room and found her sitting by the window, holding the book in her hands. "Mom, why aren't you doing anything today?" he asked, trying to keep a neutral tone, though his impatience was obvious. "We have things to prepare." Angel looked up from her book, with a calmness that threw Charles off. Her eyes reflected a determination he hadn't seen in a very long time. "Charles, I think it's time you learned how to manage your own house. I'm not a young woman who can do everything for you anymore." Charles fell silent, unable to process what he'd just heard. For years he had relied on his mother to sustain the things he could not, or would not, do. And now, suddenly, she was setting a boundary. Although he tried to respond evasively, a fear began to grow inside him. Angel was changing. The security he'd always felt, knowing he had her unconditional support, was beginning to waver. Angel, for her part, went back to her book. Her heart was pounding, not with fear, but with a mixture of liberation and pride. She knew this was just the first step, but it was an important one. For the first time in years, she had put her own needs above everyone else's demands. And though the path to true emotional independence would be long, Angel knew she was willing to walk it. The tension in Charles's house was palpable. For weeks, Sarah had watched her husband sink deeper into his lies and his obsessive quest to maintain a facade of success that no one believed anymore. Each argument, each evasive response, each nervous glance Charles cast when he thought no one was looking, weighed on Sarah's heart like an unbearable burden. She had been his partner for years, but now she felt she barely recognized the man she had shared her life with. One night, while Charles was away, Sarah decided to act. She had spent too many sleepless nights wondering how far she was willing to go to protect the family from her husband's destructive decisions. In his study, she began to review the papers that Charles always kept carefully locked away. It didn't take her long to find what she was looking for. In a locked drawer, she still had the duplicate key. She found an envelope containing financial documents that confirmed what she had suspected: accumulated debts, mortgaged properties, overdue payments, and the clauses of the loan with the Duarte brothers. Sarah sat at the desk, her hands trembling as she examined each sheet. The extent of the disaster was greater than she had imagined. Charles hadn't just put the family home at risk. He had driven his relationship with the Duartes to a dangerous tipping point. She knew they wouldn't be patient indefinitely, and that when the deadline expired, the consequences would be devastating. That same night, Sarah made a drastic decision. Without telling anyone, she left the house with the documents in a folder. Her destination was clear. She would meet with Emilio Duarte. She'd heard enough about the brothers' methods to know they were ruthless, but she also understood that the only language they spoke was that of leverage. With these papers, Sarah had something that could change the rules of the game. At a discreet restaurant on the outskirts of town, Emilio waited for her. He was seated at a corner table, wearing an impeccable suit and wearing a calculated smile that never reached his eyes. When Sarah arrived, he stood politely, though his movements were measured, like a predator studying its prey. "Mrs. Sarah, what a surprise to receive your call," Emilio said as they sat down. "What can I do for you?" Sarah slid the folder across the table without preamble. Her voice was steady, though inside she felt a mix of fear and determination. "Charles can't pay you. This should be enough for you to take action." Emilio opened the folder and reviewed the documents with the precision of someone used to finding weaknesses in others. When he finished, he looked up, a satisfied smile on his face. "This will make things much easier," he said, closing the folder with a soft thump. Sarah did not respond. She knew what she had done would change everything, but she was also convinced that Charles needed to face the consequences of his actions. After the meeting, she returned home in silence, feeling both relief and guilt weigh on her chest. The next morning, Charles discovered that something was wrong. His desk was disordered, and several important documents were missing. In a fit of rage, he stomped upstairs and entered the bedroom where Sarah was folding clothes. His footsteps were heavy, his face red with fury. "What did you do?" he yelled, waving the papers he still held. "You've been going through my stuff." Sarah turned to face him, her back straight and her eyes full of resolve. "I did it because I'm tired of you destroying this family. Maybe it's time you face the consequences of your actions, Charles." Sarah's words hit him like a punch. For years he had controlled the narrative in his home, but now his wife stood before him with a strength he hadn't expected. "This is a betrayal!" Charles shouted, unable to contain himself. "Whose side are you on? How dare you go behind my back?" With tears in her eyes but unwavering, Sarah replied, "I'm on our family's side, Charles. Something you forgot a long time ago." Charles, blinded by his anger, demanded that she leave. "If you can't support me, then you have no business staying here." Sarah said nothing else. With a broken heart, she packed a few of her things and left the house. As she closed the door behind her, part of her deeply regretted what she was losing, but another part knew she had done the right thing. From the window, Charles watched her go, feeling for the first time that he was truly alone. His fury began to mingle with something deeper, a fear he could not ignore. The days passed, heavy with tension in Charles's house. After Sarah's departure, the atmosphere turned dark and silent, as if everyone awaited the inevitable moment when the truth would come to light. Angel, though she tried to keep to her routine, could not ignore Sophia's worried looks or the tense murmurs between Julian and Charles. It was clear that something big was approaching. That afternoon, Julian made a decision. He could no longer allow Charles to evade the truth. He called everyone to the living room, incriminating documents in hand. Angel sat on the sofa, frowning, while Sophia took a seat beside her, an expression mixing curiosity and fear on her face. Charles arrived a few minutes later, his face hardening as he noticed the seriousness in his brother's eyes. "What is all this, Julian?" Charles asked, crossing his arms. Julian wasted no time. He spread the papers out on the table and began to speak firmly. "Charles, this has to end. I've reviewed the documents. You used Mom's house as collateral for your loan. You've been using her as your emotional and financial backup, all to maintain your facade of success." Charles clenched his jaw, but before he could respond, Angel, her face stricken, asked, "Is this true, Charles? Is all this because of my house?" For a moment, Charles faltered. His mother's words seemed to pierce him in a way even Julian's had not. Finally, he tried to justify his actions. "Mom, you don't understand. I did this for us, to keep the family together. You always said the most important thing was not to lose what we'd built." Angel remained silent for a long moment, her gaze fixed on Charles. She seemed to be processing not only what she had just heard, but years of decisions, manipulations, and sacrifices that now took on a new meaning. Finally, she raised her voice with a strength that surprised everyone in the room. "Charles, I did everything you asked for years because I believed in you. But now I see that you only used me for your own benefit. Every decision you made wasn't for us. It was for you, for your pride, your illusions of grandeur." Charles tried to defend himself, raising his hands in a desperate gesture. "Mom, I only wanted you to have a better life, to lack nothing. Do you really think I did this out of selfishness?" Before he could continue, Julian cut him off with a sharp voice. "Enough, Charles. It's time you take responsibility for your actions. You can't keep hiding behind Mom. She has sacrificed enough for you, and it's time you give back something of what you took from her." Charles was left speechless, trapped between the accusing looks of his brother and his mother. Angel, tears in her eyes, stood up from the sofa, yet her posture was firm, almost defiant. "Charles, I want you to leave this house. I need time to think about what I want, not what you need. For the first time, I want to decide for myself." Charles, defeated, lowered his head. He knew he had no more excuses, that the control he had exercised over his mother for so long had crumbled. Without another word, he left the living room, leaving behind a silence that felt like a heavy blow. Julian approached Angel and hugged her gently, as if afraid she might break. Sophia joined them, holding her grandmother warmly, as if wrapping her in a mantle of support and love. The family was broken, but at that moment, Angel felt something she hadn't experienced in years: control over her own life. Though the road ahead would be difficult, she knew she was ready to face it with the support of those who truly loved her. Night fell thick and heavy, steeped in a tension that seemed to fill every corner of the house. Angel was seated in the living room with Julian and Sophia. Though they tried to maintain light conversation, all three knew the air was heavy with uncertainty. The recent confrontation with Charles had left fresh scars, and though Angel tried to appear calm, her gaze revealed the burden she carried day after day. The fragile calm shattered suddenly when a luxury vehicle braked abruptly in front of the house. The sound of tires on pavement echoed like a gunshot in the night. Julian and Sophia exchanged alarmed glances, while Angel placed a hand on her chest, feeling her heart begin to pound. The front door burst open. Emilio and Tony Duarte, dressed in dark suits that seemed to absorb what little light there was, entered with firm steps, followed by two bodyguards who closed the door behind them. Their serious faces and calculated movements made it clear they hadn't come to negotiate. From his study, Charles heard the slam and ran to the living room. His face was pale, sweat beading on his forehead. As soon as he crossed the threshold, Emilio cut him off with a sharp voice. "Charles, time's up! We're here to take what belongs to us!" Charles raised his hands, a desperate attempt to calm the situation. "I still have a week. This isn't necessary. I'm working on it." Emilio smiled coldly, as if Charles's words were merely an echo that failed to reach him. He stepped forward and began to look around the house with disdain. "A week, a day, it doesn't matter. We're here because we don't trust your words. We never have." Emilio gestured to one of the bodyguards. "Point out what we can take." The bodyguard began to survey the room, examining the furniture, decorations, and other valuables. Meanwhile, Tony approached Angel, who remained immobile in her seat. "So, this is the famous family home," he said mockingly, his gaze sweeping over the frail woman clinging to Julian's arm. "A pity it has to end up as collateral." Angel drew back, clinging tighter to Julian's arm. Her legs began to tremble, her breathing quickened. Tony's words pierced her mind, triggering a panic she had struggled to keep at bay for days. "This can't be happening. This house, it's all we have left," she murmured, her voice cracking, barely audible. Julian stepped forward, placing himself between the Duartes and his mother. "Enough. You have no right to intimidate her. If you have claims, direct them at me or at Charles, but don't involve her." Emilio, unruffled, looked at Julian with a mix of contempt and boredom. "This isn't personal, it's business, and your dear brother has already made us waste enough time." Chaos intensified when one of the bodyguards tried to take an antique vase from a side table. Angel, unable to bear more, let out a choked cry before collapsing. Her body slumped to one side, and Julian barely managed to catch her before she hit the floor. Sophia rushed over, panic etched on her face. "Grandma!" Sophia cried, holding one of Angel's hands while Julian tried to revive her. Charles, standing on the other side of the room, seemed paralyzed. His impotence was obvious. He could do nothing but watch as the situation slipped completely out of his control. Emilio, however, maintained his icy demeanor. He took a few steps toward the door before turning back with one last warning. "You have until tomorrow to hand over this property. We don't want trouble, but we know how to solve it if we must." With those words, Emilio and Tony left, leaving an atmosphere charged with fear and despair behind them. The roar of the SUV's engine was heard once again as they drove away, but it couldn't drown out the echo of their threatening words. In the living room, Julian carried Angel to the sofa, while Sophia fetched water and something to fan her with. The woman slowly regained consciousness, but her face still showed the terror of what she'd just witnessed. Charles remained silent, watching from a corner, like a spectator at his own disaster. Angel opened her eyes and searched for Julian's gaze, her voice barely a whisper. "This must stop, Julian. I can't go on anymore." Julian squeezed her hand gently, his face hardened by determination. "It will stop, Mom. I promise." As silence reclaimed the house, they all knew that the confrontation with the Duartes had been only the beginning. But Julian, with his mother and daughter by his side, was more determined than ever to protect what remained of his family. The drive to the hospital was wrapped in tense, suffocating silence. Julian gripped the steering wheel tightly, while Sophia, in the back seat, held Angel's hand. Angel was breathing with difficulty, her pale face and frail body a reminder of all she had endured in silence. Julian glanced at his mother in the rearview mirror every few seconds, his concern reflected in the intensity of his gaze. When they arrived at the hospital, the medical staff acted quickly. Angel was placed on a gurney, while Julian and Sophia stayed close, making sure she wasn't alone. The hospital halls, with their cold white light, seemed to stretch the weight, each second heavier than the last. Hours later, a doctor emerged from the room where they were treating Angel. Her expression was professional, but her tone was compassionate. "Your mother suffered a severe anxiety attack, likely brought on by accumulated stress. She's stable now, but she needs rest and, above all, a calmer environment. This level of pressure is not sustainable for someone her age." Julian nodded, thanking the doctor, while Sophia pressed her lips together, her eyes moist with worry. Both of them entered the room where Angel slept soundly, her breathing finally steady. Julian took a seat beside her bed, while Sophia settled near the window, arms crossed, gazing outside. It didn't take long for Charles to arrive. He entered the hospital with slumped shoulders and a grim face, as if each step dragged him deeper into the ground. When he found Julian and Sophia in the waiting room, he said nothing. He sat down in a chair at the far end, not daring to look at his brother. The silence between them was long and heavy, until Julian could no longer contain his anger. He stood up and approached Charles, his eyes full of reproach. "All of this is your fault," he said quietly, but with emotion. "Your greed, your lies. Mom should never have been put through this." Charles looked up, revealing genuine pain in his eyes for the first time. He didn't try to defend himself. Instead, his words emerged in a broken tone that disarmed Julian, if only momentarily. "Do you think I don't know? Do you think I don't realize I've disappointed her?" Charles took a deep breath, as though it pained him to admit what came next. "Ever since Dad died, I thought it was my duty to carry everything, that if I managed to keep us afloat, she'd be proud of me. But the more I tried to prove I could handle it all, the more I lost myself, and lost her too. Julian folded his arms, the anger still burning inside him, but something in Charles's words forced him to pause. For the first time in years, he saw not the cold manipulator he'd grown to despise, but a man broken by his own insecurities. "That doesn't justify what you did," Julian said at last, his voice less sharp but still firm. "If you really wanted to protect Mom, you ended up doing the opposite." Charles nodded slowly, unable to argue. "I know," he whispered, "but I don't know how to fix it anymore." Silence filled the room again, but this time it felt different, less hostile and more reflective. Julian, still furious over everything that had happened, decided not to push further. Something in Charles's posture, in his distant gaze, made him realize his brother was finally facing the consequences of his actions in a way he never had before. Sophia appeared in the doorway, her voice gentle. "Grandma is awake. She asked for you both." Both brothers stood and walked together toward the room. They exchanged no more words, but in that moment, something had changed. Though the wounds remained open and tensions unresolved, the weight of years of resentment had begun to ease. For the first time, Julian saw a spark of humanity in Charles, and although it wasn't enough to fully forgive him, it was a step towards something resembling reconciliation. The hospital room lay in semi-darkness, illuminated only by the soft glow of the bedside lamp. Julian, Sophia, and Charles remained silent, each consumed by their own thoughts, while the steady beeping of Angel's heart monitor marked time with a monotonous rhythm. Sophia sat beside her grandmother, holding her hand gently, while Julian watched from a corner, arms crossed, his face lined with worry. Charles, in the opposite corner, kept silent, his hunched posture reflecting a burden that seemed to crush him. Hours later, Angel began to stir slightly. A soft sigh escaped her lips, and her eyes slowly fluttered open. Julian noticed first and hurried over, followed by Sophia, who squeezed her grandmother's hand tenderly. Charles hesitated at first, but finally approached as well, though he kept a slight distance. Angel looked around, taking in the sight of her two sons and her granddaughter. Though her body appeared frail, there was a light in her eyes that hadn't been there for a long time. With effort, she sat up a bit, and her voice, though soft, carried a firm tone that commanded everyone's attention. "Charles," she said, directing her gaze at him, "you are my son. I have always loved you and always will, but that doesn't mean you can keep hurting me. It's time you face what you've done." Charles remained still, as if his mother's words had frozen him. For a moment, he seemed to try to find a response, but all that came out was a ragged sigh. Tears began to fill his eyes, and when he finally spoke, his voice was cracked with emotion. "Mom, I'm sorry. I can't fix everything I've done, but I want to try. I don't want to lose you. I don't want you to feel like I don't value everything you've done for me." Angel studied him in silence for a moment, her eyes probing for the truth behind his words. At last, she nodded slightly, though her expression remained serious. "If you truly want to change, Charles, you have to show it," she said calmly but firmly, making it clear she would no longer accept excuses. "I don't want words, I want actions. And you must understand that I can't keep supporting you in everything. It's time you take responsibility." Julian, who had been listening quietly, now spoke up. His tone was cooler than his mother's, but there was a small opening in his words. "Charles, I won't lie to you. I don't trust you. But if you really want to change, start by taking responsibility for everything you've done. And this time, let others help you. You can't keep destroying those around you while trying to fix your life." Charles raised his eyes to his brother and nodded slowly. "I know, and I accept that. I'm willing to do whatever it takes to fix this, to fix myself." The silence that followed was tense, but carried a kind of relief. Angel, looking at her two sons, let out a deep sigh. and for the first time in years, a small smile curved her lips. Despite everything that had happened, she felt there was a possibility, a faint ray of hope that the family could begin to heal. Sophia, who had remained quiet until then, spoke softly. "If everyone is willing to try, then we have a chance. But we need to be honest, to listen to each other, and above all, to care for one another." Angel nodded, feeling the weight of those words in her heart. She extended her hands to Julian and Charles, who hesitated only for an instant before taking them. It was a simple gesture, but laden with meaning. For the first time in a long while, the three of them were united, not by conflict, but by the will to move forward. The family was not healed, but this moment marked a turning point. There was work to be done, wounds to heal, and trust to rebuild. But for the first time, Angel felt a genuine possibility of reconciliation. And after so many years of struggle and pain, that was a beginning. Daybreak arrived with a deceptive clarity, as if the sun didn't understand the emotional weight pressing on the family. Angel's house, which for decades had been the heart of their lives, was about to slip from their hands. The Duartes, ruthless and patient only to a point, would take possession the next day. Yet Angel appeared surprisingly calm as they prepared to gather their belongings. When Julian parked the car in front of the house, he gazed at the facade with a mix of sadness and resolve. Sophia, seated in the back seat, leaned forward and gently touched her father's shoulder. "We'll be okay, Dad. Grandma always says material things aren't the most important." Inside the house, Angel seemed to confirm those words. She moved slowly through the halls, collecting only what was essential, and she spoke a phrase that would resonate in all their hearts. "A house is just walls. The real family lives in the bonds we share." Julian and Sophia helped her pack, moving carefully through rooms filled with memories. For Sophia, who had grown up hearing stories of this place, the process was a kind of discovery. She watched her grandmother carefully store old photos, yellowed letters, and small objects that seemed to hold centuries of family history. Each item Angel placed in a box had special meaning: a framed photo of her husband, a sewing kit used when her children were small, a doll that once belonged to Sophia. "Grandma, do you want me to take this?" Sophia asked, holding a small ceramic vase that seemed out of place among the practical items Angel was packing. Angel looked at it with a warm smile and nodded. "Your grandfather made that one. It's one of the few things that still remind me how he used to laugh when he was in the workshop." "Take it, Sophia." They worked in silence for hours, and by the end of the day, the boxes were stacked in the living room, ready to be moved. Angel took one last look at the house, her fingers grazing the wall near the door as if saying goodbye. But she did not weep. Instead, her face showed a calm determination, as though she understood this wasn't an ending, but a new beginning. The move to Julian's small apartment in town was simple, but symbolic. The space, though modest, was cozy. Natural light filled the place, and the family's closeness made it feel more like a home than the large but empty house they'd left behind. Angel, far from feeling sad, seemed lighter. Without the pressure of maintaining a big house or meeting Charles's constant demands, she discovered a freedom she hadn't felt in years. One day, while Sophia and Angel organized the kitchen, Julian returned with a bouquet of flowers. "These are for you, Mom," he said, placing them on the table. Angel smiled, touched by the gesture. "Thank you, son. This place already feels like home, but this makes it even more special." Over time, Angel began to find small pleasures in her new life, walking through the local market, cooking for Sophia and Julian, even sitting on the apartment's tiny balcony with a book. Each activity, though simple, reminded her that life could still offer moments of peace and happiness. Meanwhile, Charles faced a very different reality. After losing everything, he decided to stay in town, but his life changed drastically. Without money or property, he had to find work at a local company. The first days were humiliating. Accustomed to a life of appearances, He now had to endure the looks of those who knew of his fall. But with time, he began to see things differently. One afternoon, while loading boxes in the warehouse where he worked, Charles paused and looked at his hands. They were rough from physical labor, something he hadn't done in years. In that moment, he felt a small spark of pride. He was starting from scratch, but for the first time in a long while, he felt he was doing something real. Charles also began visiting Angel in the apartment. At first, the visits were brief and awkward, but gradually, the time he spent with his mother and brother became a balm. One afternoon, while sharing tea, Charles turned to Angel with a look of sincere gratitude. "Mom, I don't know if I can ever make it up to you, but I want you to know that I'm trying to be better." Angel took his hand with a serene smile. "That's all I need, Charles, for you to try." The path to rebuilding trust and family bonds wouldn't be easy or quick, but for the first time, everyone was moving in the same direction. With the apartment as a new starting point, each family member learned to value the small things, to find happiness in everyday moments, and above all, to support each other through the challenges that lay ahead. Time passed like a gentle breeze, carrying away some of the sorrows that had marked the family. Months after the events that had forever changed their lives, Angel found herself on the balcony of Julian's small apartment. The sun bathed the town's streets, and she held a cup of tea in her hands as she watched life unfold below with renewed calm. It was an ordinary day, but for her, every moment of peace felt like a gift. The apartment's doorbell rang, interrupting her thoughts. From the kitchen, where he was busy, Julian glanced out and asked, "Must be Charles. Want me to get it?" Angel shook her head and walked toward the door with steady steps. When she opened it, she found her youngest son holding a potted plant. Although Charles seemed more at ease than in the past, there was still a hint of unease in his eyes, as if he feared he might not measure up. "Mom," he said, holding the plant out toward her, "I wanted to bring you this. It's something small, but I thought it might cheer you up." Angel observed him for a moment before smiling broadly and taking the plant in her hands. "It's perfect, Charles. You know, I always wanted something green for this corner." She invited him in, and the two of them sat down in the small living room. Julian and Sophia, respecting the moment, remained busy in the kitchen and dining area. Charles seemed to relax further as the conversation progressed, and soon they began talking about the future. "Mom," said Charles more seriously, "I've been thinking a lot about what I want to do with my life. I know I've made a lot of mistakes, but I also know I want to make the most of this second chance. I'm working hard, and even though it's not much, I've started saving. Maybe someday I can give back some of what I took from you." Angel took his hand and squeezed it gently. "Charles, I don't need you to give me anything material. All I ever wanted was for you to find your path and learn to value what truly matters. It seems you're finally headed in that direction, and that's enough for me." Charles nodded, his eyes shining with tears he refused to let fall. For the first time in years, he felt he was building something genuine, and that brought him a peace he had never known before. Elsewhere in the apartment, Sophia sat at her desk, writing in her journal. The words flowed easily as she reflected on everything she had experienced these past months. "I've learned that love isn't always perfect, but it can heal even the deepest wounds. My grandmother is the strongest person I know, and my dad has shown that it's never too late to change. Maybe we can't control everything that happens in our lives, but we can always choose to love. And in that love, find the strength to carry on." She finished writing and closed the journal, feeling a weight lifted from her chest. She looked toward the living room, where she saw her grandmother and uncle talking and couldn't help but smile. That evening, the family gathered for a simple but meaningful dinner. The dining table, though small, was filled with laughter and anecdotes. Julian served the food, while Angel sat at the head of the table, watching her children and granddaughter with an expression that mixed pride and gratitude. Charles shared stories from his work, and Sophia, with her characteristic enthusiasm, enriched them with details that made everyone laugh. As the hours passed, the conversation grew calmer. Angel, her eyes shining with emotion, took a moment to look at each person present. At that instant, she felt something she hadn't experienced in years. Peace. Not the peace of perfection, but the peace that comes from effort, from love that endures even through the darkest moments. The last image was of the family together, surrounded by warmth and hope, an image Angel would treasure forever. They had faced pain, loss, and uncertainty, but they were together, and for her, that was all that mattered. Author's note. Reflection. Angel's story and that of her family is a powerful reminder of the complexities of love, the wounds we inherit, and the second chances that can arise even in the darkest moments. It's a reflection on how family dynamics can become a web of sacrifice, expectations, and resentments, and how, despite mistakes, there is always the possibility of redemption and healing. At the heart of this story is Angel, a mother who dedicated her life to her children, often at her own expense. Her experience reflects the emotional burden many people carry in silence, believing constant self-sacrifice is the only way to show love. Yet what Angel learns, and ultimately teaches her family, is that true love doesn't mean erasing oneself, but rather finding a balance between giving and receiving. It's the moment Angel begins to reclaim her voice and autonomy that the family dynamic shifts, allowing everyone to face the truths they had long avoided. Charles, for his part, is a portrait of how self-imposed pressures and misguided ambition can lead to devastating decisions. His desire to protect his family and preserve a legacy became a blind pursuit of success that not only distanced him from those he loved, but also trapped him in a cycle of guilt and denial. However, his downfall allowed him to see clearly, and his willingness to face the consequences and work to rebuild broken bonds shows that it's never too late to change. Julian represents the other side of the coin, the struggle between the desire to protect others and the frustration over past mistakes. His return home was not only an act of reconciliation, but also an opportunity to face the wounds he had tried to leave behind. Through his support of Angel and his firmness with Charles, Julian demonstrates that family love often requires courage, patience, and a willingness to confront uncomfortable truths. Sophia, in her youth, offers a fresh and thoughtful perspective. Her ability to observe, question, and connect the dots shows how younger generations can be catalysts for change in family dynamics. Through her empathy and sensitivity, Sophia helps Angel rediscover her worth and Charles face his errors, reminding us that intergenerational understanding can be a source of healing and growth. Ultimately, this story teaches us that families, though imperfect, can find ways to rebuild themselves if there is a willingness to change and love to sustain them. Emotional wounds don't disappear overnight, but with time, effort, and honesty, they can turn into scars that remind us not only of the pain we endured, but also of the strength we found in ourselves and each other. The house they lost was not just a building. It was a symbol of the sacrifices, memories, and mistakes that bound them together. By leaving it behind, they also left behind the weight of unsustainable expectations and old hurts. In their new home, more modest but full of hope, they found something more valuable, the chance to start anew, with more genuine and meaningful relationships. This story is, ultimately, a tribute to the power of love, resilience, and the human capacity for reinvention. It reminds us that, although we cannot change the past, we can always choose how we face the present and build the future. And that is the greatest lesson of all. Even in loss and downfall, there's room for hope, healing, and new beginnings. Thank you for joining us on this journey filled with emotion and growth. Angel's story and her family's has left us with great lessons about love, the importance of honesty, and how second chances can change everything. If this story touched your heart or made you reflect, don't forget to give it a like subscribe to the channel, and ring the notification bell so you don't miss any of our upcoming tales. Remember, there's always light at the end of the road, and each new day is an opportunity to start anew. Leave us your comments. Which part of the story impacted you most? Did you identify with any character? We'd love to read your thoughts and reflections. Until next time, and remember, the true strengths in life are not found in material things, but in the bonds we build with those we love most. See you soon.